At 8:17 p.m., Muwaffaq Salti Air Base in the Jordanian desert sat in the darkness east of the city of Zarqa, its F-16 flight line quiet in the post-afternoon sortie lull between the day's final maintenance cycle and the pre-dawn preparations for the next day's missions. The base was the home of the Jordan Air Force's primary fighter wing and hosted a rotational American expeditionary fighter presence. F-15Es from the 492nd Expeditionary Fighter Squadron that had been operating from Muwaffaq for 3 weeks, conducting strike missions against IRGC infrastructure in Syria and contributing to the theater air picture that the American campaign required. The base was not Al Udeid. It did not carry the operational weight of the Central Gulf installations, but it was real military power at a real location, and its position in Jordan, a country that had quietly but consequentially aligned itself with the coalition's efforts, while maintaining the careful public posture that Jordanian domestic politics required, made it a symbol that the IRGC's strategic messaging had been trying to address since the first week of the conflict. The political dimension of the target was as important to the IRGC's planning as the military one. Jordan's King Abdullah II had coordinated closely with Washington throughout the conflict, providing overflight rights, intelligence sharing, and the quiet basing access that the Muwaffaq F-15E presence represented. Jordan had done this while managing a population whose sympathies on the Palestinian and broader regional question were complex, and while maintaining a public posture that emphasized diplomatic engagement and humanitarian concern rather than military partnership. A successful IRGC strike on Muwaffaq would accomplish 2 things simultaneously. It would demonstrate that no country in the region could provide access to American forces without consequence, and it would place the Jordanian government in the domestic political difficulty of explaining an attack on its own sovereign territory that had occurred partly because of that government's quiet military cooperation. The strategic calculation was careful. The operational planning that supported it was extensive. The weapons assigned to the Muwaffaq strike had been selected through a targeting analysis that had begun on day 4 of the conflict, when the signals intelligence picture had confirmed the F-15E presence at Muwaffaq and had assessed the base's contribution to the theater air campaign as operationally significant. The analysis had taken 13 days because the specific weapon mix required a combination of ballistic missiles, fast drones, and terrain-following cruise missiles on 3 different azimuths demanded careful timing synchronization that the IRGC's planning staff had never previously executed against a target at this range and geographic complexity. 3 weapons types, 3 approach corridors, 3 different time-of-flight calculations that had to be synchronized to produce simultaneous terminal phase arrivals within a window that would stress all defensive layers simultaneously rather than allowing sequential engagement. The planning staff had run the synchronization calculation 11 times before they were satisfied that the timing parameters were achievable. The final planning document, which the operational intelligence picture had confirmed was ready for execution on day 12, specified a total flight time synchronization tolerance of plus or minus 40 seconds across all 3 weapon types. The actual execution, when it came, achieved a tolerance of 31 seconds between the first Fateh 313 terminal arrival and the last Quds 3 approach detection. 31 seconds within a synchronized multi-weapon attack across 3 approach corridors. It was the most precisely executed IRGC Aerospace Force operation in the conflict's history. It was also because of the THAAD repositioning that had occurred 2 days before execution, the one that encountered the most directly optimized defense it would ever face. The weapons assigned to the Muwaffaq strike were configured for the specific target set. 14 Fateh 313 ballistic missiles from launch complexes in western Iran provided the ballistic layer, their accuracy sufficient to aim at specific buildings and runway sections, their maneuvering re-entry vehicles complicating the intercept geometry. 8 Shahed 238 variant drones, The jet-propelled Shahed, faster than the propeller-driven 136 variant, capable of reaching speeds that compress the close-in engagement timeline, were assigned to approach from a different azimuth than the ballistic missiles, timed to arrive in the Muwaffaq area approximately 90 seconds after the ballistic impact window, when the defensive systems would be managing the post-engagement reconstitution cycle. And, in the most operationally sophisticated element of the strike package, 4 Quds-3 cruise missiles flying a terrain-masked route through the Syrian-Jordanian border terrain, hugging the wadis and ridgelines of the eastern Syrian desert, below radar detection altitude for the majority of their approach, were assigned to the runway infrastructure specifically. The Quds-3's sea-skimming variant had been modified for land terrain following, using a digital terrain database that allowed the missile to follow ground contours at extremely low altitude in the same way that manned aircraft fly nap-of-Earth profiles. The 4 terrain-following Quds-3 were the element that had been most difficult to develop and most carefully protected in the IRGC's operational security. They were also the element that the American intelligence picture had taken longest to characterize. The first 13 days of the strike's intelligence signature were dominated by the Fateh 313 preparation activity, the familiar indicators of ballistic missile preparation that the Space Force constellation and the signals intelligence collection architecture had become expert at recognizing through 3 weeks of continuous observation. The Quds-3 terrain-following variant's development and preparation signature was less familiar because this capability had not been employed in previous strikes. Its preparation activity looked, at first review, like the standard Quds-3 maritime configuration. The difference between the maritime configuration and the terrain-following variant, a difference in the guidance electronics package and the digital terrain database loading sequence, produced an emission signature that was detectable but required a specific analytical context to interpret correctly. That context was provided on day 9 by a human intelligence source who described the IRGC Aerospace Force's terrain-following cruise missile program in enough technical detail to allow the signals analysts to reinterpret the collection they had already acquired. The reinterpretation was completed at 2:14 a.m. on day 10. The Muwaffaq target set was updated at 4:47 a.m. to include the terrain-following approach from the Syrian border.
The update triggered a repositioning of the theater air defense architecture in Jordan. A THAAD battery that had been positioned north of Amman for the capital area defense was moved on day 11 to a position east of Zarqa that gave it better coverage of the approaches from the Syrian border. The repositioning required 41 hours of logistics and setup. It was completed at 6 p.m. on day 12. The Muwaffaq strike was launched on day 13 at 8:17 p.m., 26 hours after the repositioned THAAD battery reached operational readiness.
At 8:17 p.m. and 9 seconds, 14 simultaneous ignition events appeared on the Space Force infrared picture over western Iran. The warning reached the Jordanian Air Defense Operations Center and the Muwaffaq base at 8:17 p.m. and 28 seconds, 19 seconds after the first ignition. The base's protective posture protocol activated immediately. The F-15E maintenance crews, the Jordan Air Force personnel, and the base's American contingent transitioned to hardened shelter positions with the efficiency of a base that had been rehearsing this protocol since the THAAD repositioning on day 11 had signaled that the threat assessment had been elevated. The Muwaffaq base commander had been briefed on the elevated threat assessment on day 12. He had initiated additional rehearsals. The rehearsals had reduced the time from alert to full shelter occupancy to 4 minutes and 12 seconds. The first Fateh 313 would arrive in the terminal phase in approximately 11 minutes and 40 seconds from the launch warning. The base had 7 minutes and 28 seconds of margin. The THAAD battery east of Zarqa acquired the Fateh 313 missiles at 8:22 p.m. as they reached the mid-course phase. The engagement geometry was the THAAD's near-optimal configuration for this approach. Azimuth and trajectory. The repositioning 11 days earlier had been specifically calculated to put the battery in exactly this position for exactly this approach. 9 of the 14 Fateh 313 missiles were engaged and intercepted between 8:22 p.m. and 8:25 p.m. and 14 seconds. 9 kill vehicles, 9 intercepts, 9 expanding debris fields above the exo-atmospheric engagement altitude. 5 missiles survived the THAAD engagement, their maneuvering re-entry vehicles having executed terminal guidance corrections that placed 3 of them at the edge of the THAAD's coverage arc. The Patriot PAC-3 MSE battery at Muwaffaq, the base's organic air defense, supplemented by the Jordan Air Force's own Patriot battery that had been brought to full readiness at 8 p.m. based on the elevated threat assessment, engaged the 5 Fateh 313 survivors between 8:25 p.m. and 8:27 p.m. and 30 seconds. Shoot doctrine, 2 PAC-3 MSE interceptors. Per Fateh 313. 10 rounds fired in 2 minutes and 30 seconds against 5 maneuvering re-entry vehicles in their terminal descent. 3 confirmed intercepts. 2 missiles survived the Patriot engagement. The first impacted the base's eastern aircraft parking apron at 8:28 p.m. and 11 seconds. The second impacted the northeastern corner of the base's fuel storage complex at 8:28 p.m. and 23 seconds. The first impact destroyed 3 parked aircraft, 2 Jordan Air Force F-16S and 1 American F-15E, and severely damaged 4 others. The aircraft had been moved from the main parking ramp to the dispersal positions at 8:18 p.m., 50 seconds after the alert. The dispersal had increased the spacing between aircraft and reduced the total aircraft exposed to any single impact's lethal radius. 16 aircraft beyond the first impact's lethal radius were undamaged. The 3 destroyed aircraft represented a painful and significant loss. They did not represent the elimination of Muwaffaq's operational capability. The second impact, the one that struck the northeastern corner of the fuel storage complex, impacted the outer berm of the fuel storage area, the hardened earthwork installed during the base's post-2020 protection upgrade. The berm absorbed the majority of the warhead's blast effect. The fuel tanks behind the berm survived. One secondary pipeline running through the berm's foundation was severed. Fuel from the severed line ignited and produced a sustained fire that the base firefighting team controlled within 19 minutes. The fuel storage tanks were intact. The primary fueling infrastructure was undamaged. The base's ability to sustain flight operations was reduced to approximately 70% capacity pending the pipeline repair, a reduction that the maintenance team assessed as correctable within 36 hours. The Shahed 238 jet-propelled drones arrived at 8:31 p.m., 90 seconds after the last Fateh 313 impact, precisely as the IRGC's timing had intended. 8 fast-moving targets at low altitude, approaching from the northwest on a different azimuth than the ballistic missiles, the timing designed to catch the defensive systems in their post-intercept reconstitution. What the timing had not accounted for was that the Muwaffaq base's SHORAD, short-range air defense, component had remained active throughout the Fateh 313 engagement, its Avenger teams and Jordan Air Force Hawk batteries unaffected by the demands on the Patriot and THAAD systems that had been handling the ballistic threats. The Avenger teams engaged 6 of the 8 Shahed 238S at ranges between 3 and 6 miles with Stinger missiles. The 2 that penetrated the Avenger engagement layer were engaged by the base's C-RAM Centurion systems at ranges between 1 and 2 miles. Both were destroyed before impact. 0 Shahed 238S reached the base.
The terrain-following Quds 3 element arrived at 8:34 p.m., 7 minutes after the Fateh 313 launches and 3 minutes after the Shahed 238s, their low-altitude terrain-following profile having extended their transit time relative to the ballistic missiles. 4 missiles, approaching from the northeast along the wadis systems of the eastern Syrian desert, their routes taking them between ridgelines and through terrain features that had kept them below radar detection for the majority of their approach. They appeared on the radar picture of the repositioned THAAD battery at 8:33 p.m. and 41 seconds, at a range of 12 miles, as they crested a ridgeline that briefly brought them above the battery's radar horizon before they descended back into the terrain shadow. 12 miles at the Quds 3's terminal dash speed of approximately Mach 1 meant approximately 58 seconds to the base perimeter.
The THAAD battery in surface surveillance mode and the Patriot battery's MPQ-65 radar in its lowest elevation scan configuration had been specifically positioned and configured to cover this approach corridor. The 12-mile detection range was not comfortable against a Mach 1 target with 58 seconds of flight time remaining, but it was not zero. The Patriot battery had been watching the Syrian border approaches since 8 p.m., specifically because the terrain following Quds 3 threat had been briefed to the battery crews on day 12. The battery commander had pre-computed engagement solutions for the most likely terrain following approach corridors. When the 4 Quds 3 appeared at 8:33 p.m. and 41 seconds, the battery's engagement solution was built within 12 seconds. The first PAC-3 MSE fired at 8:33 p.m. and 53 seconds. 3 more in rapid sequence. 2 Quds 3 were intercepted at ranges between 7 and 9 miles. The third was engaged and hit, but survived in a damaged configuration that caused it to veer from its programmed course and impact a hillside 2 miles north of the base perimeter. The fourth Quds 3, the one on the most westerly approach corridor, the one that the engagement sequencing had reached last, was engaged at 8:34 p.m. and 21 seconds by the Jordan Air Force Patriot battery, which had been assigned the western approach sectors. The Jordan battery's crew performed their intercept at a range of 4 miles, the shortest engagement range of the night, the PAC-3 MSE kill vehicle passing through the Quds 3's guidance system and detonating. The debris fell in the open desert 500 meters northwest of the runway threshold. No aircraft was damaged. No personnel was injured. At 8:35 p.m., the engagement was complete. 14 Fateh 313 missiles, 8 Shahed 238 drones, and 4 terrain-following Quds. 3 cruise missiles had been launched. 11 of the Fateh 313 missiles had been intercepted. 2 had impacted the base, destroying 3 aircraft and damaging the outer berm of the fuel storage area. All 8 Shahed 238s had been neutralized before impact. 3 of the 4 terrain-following Quds 3 had been intercepted or caused to deviate. 1 had hit a hillside north of the perimeter. 0 personnel at Muwaffaq had been killed or seriously injured. The base was damaged. The base was operational.
The response was designated Operation Desert Judgement. The targeting package for Desert Judgement addressed both the Iranian launch infrastructure and the Syrian-based elements that had supported the terrain following Quds 3's approach. The Iranian launch complexes that had fired the Fateh 313 missiles were addressed by B-1B Lancer, ASSMER strikes beginning at 9:44 p.m., 1 hour and 27 minutes after the Muwaffaq strike. The Quds 3 terrain-following variants development infrastructure, the IRGC Aerospace Force Facility at Semnan, where the digital terrain database loading had been conducted, the Guidance Modification Facility at Isfahan, where the terrain-following electronics package had been installed, and the Operational Storage Complex near Tabriz, from which the 4 Quds 3 had been deployed, were addressed by a B-2A Spirit strike at 9:51 p.m., their precise locations having been characterizable only because the human intelligence source who had described the terrain-following program had included facility locations in his reporting.
The Syrian support infrastructure, the staging position in the Deir ez-Zor desert from which the Quds 3 had been launched, and the fuel and logistics depot that had supported the Quds 3's extended-range terrain-following mission, was addressed by the F-35A package from Prince Sultan at 9:37 p.m. The staging position was struck with GBU-39 small-diameter bombs. The logistics depot, assessed as containing residual CUDs, 3 propellant and guidance components, received GBU-31 impacts that produced secondary explosions consistent with stored propellant material. At 10:47 p.m., the post-strike preliminary assessment was transmitted to the CAOC. The Muwaffaq strike had been the most operationally complex IRGC aerospace force attack on a Jordanian target in the conflict's history. The combination of 3 weapon types, 3 approach azimuths, and the innovation of the terrain-following cruise missile had produced a strike that had genuinely challenged the defensive architecture and had achieved 2 impacts on base infrastructure. The loss of 3 aircraft was real and painful. The damage to the fuel storage berm was significant and repairable. The operational effect was not what the IRGC's planners had calculated. The base was operational, its command and control function was intact, its runways were clear, and its F-15E contingent had all aircraft that were undamaged, fueled, armed, and ready for the next mission cycle. At 5 a.m. the following morning, the first F-15E mission from Muwaffaq departed on schedule. The pilot flew the standard departure profile, climbed through the pre-dawn Jordanian sky to cruise altitude, and turned east towards Syria. The target for the mission was an IRGC Aerospace Force command node that had coordinated the previous evening's strike. The mission had been planned during the night, while the base's damage assessment teams were completing their survey, and while the engineering crews were beginning the fuel pipeline repair. The mission went. The target was struck. The base at Muwaffaq was still in the war. The engineering crews that had worked through the night completed the fuel pipeline repair at 4:17 a.m., 43 minutes ahead of the 36-hour estimate that had been given in the immediate post-impact assessment. The estimate had been conservative, as initial battlefield damage assessments tend to be, because the severity of the break was less than the worst-case scenario the engineers had prepared for. The pipeline repair restored the fueling capacity to 94% of pre-strike levels, the remaining 6% being the secondary lines that had been taken offline as a precautionary measure and would require a separate inspection cycle before reactivation. 94% was sufficient for the morning's mission cycle. The F-15E that departed at 5 a.m. had been fueled from the repaired infrastructure. It departed on full fuel. The Jordan Air Force's maintenance and repair crews addressed the 3 destroyed aircraft with the systematic documentation that military aviation requires after combat losses, the official loss reports, the inventory adjustment, the parts and equipment salvage assessments. The aircraft were gone. Their pilots were alive, in shelters, uninjured. The Jordan Air Force's operational capacity at Muwaffaq was reduced by 3 airframes. It was not reduced to 0. It was not reduced to the level where operations had to pause. The IRGC had aimed at Jordan's cooperation with the American coalition. They had aimed at the political vulnerability of a government that had bet its credibility on managing 2 things simultaneously: the quiet military partnership and the domestic political pressure that came with it. The bet had been a reasonable one. An attack on Jordanian sovereign territory that destroyed aircraft and damaged infrastructure would cost the Jordanian government politically, regardless of the military outcome. What it had not cost was the Jordanian government's commitment. At 7 a.m., King Abdullah II released a statement. The statement did not reference American partnership or coalition membership. It referenced the Hashemite kingdom of Jordan's sovereign right to defend its territory and its people, and its determination to do so in partnership with those who shared its commitment to regional stability. The language was Jordanian. The substance was unambiguous. In the calculus of coercion, the target that endures is the message that fails.